So I'm gonna start back with the phosphorus cycle. So this is where we had left off last time, and I had talked about how there was a slow and a fast component to this. So the slow P cycle, the slow phosphorus cycle, is sort of the part of the phosphorus cycle that predominated prior to the advent of humans, prior to humans getting on the scene. So that basically is rocks, phosphorus that's in the mountains, washes away with rain, and phosphorus goes down into the land and into the water, and eventually sediments, deposits, and enters into the geologic record, and then as sedimentary rock, and then eventually with time maybe metamorphizes, whatever happens to it in the rock. It can take upwards of 500 million years between when the phosphorus originally sediments and then when it emerges and is washed back into the environment. All right, so that's 500 million years. Life has only been on the planet for a couple billion years, or 4 billion, I guess. 3.5 billion was the banded iron formation. So, it takes a long time. There's a lot of phosphorus that never contacts biology at all. There's the bulk, the majority of phosphorus on the planet never comes in contact with the biome, biological cycling. So then there's the fast P cycle, and this is phosphorus that does interact with biology. That's the part of this little cartoon I have on the right-hand side with the cows. So plants take up phosphorus, use it. Phosphate is important. We'll investigate it chemically much more. Cows eat it. Their excrement, they die, whatever, goes in as waste, and it cycles much more quickly. The phosphorus that's in soil is what's getting turned up and going around. That can take anywhere from a few years to hundreds of thousands of years. And this involves soil, water, plants, animals. Phosphorus is a particular problem in our waterways not because it's poisonous per se. A lot of people in those quizzes I handed back, first of all, it was clear a number of you didn't listen to them. You should listen to them so that you don't bomb those quizzes. But it was clear that a number of you are confusing nitrogen and phosphorus. It's nitrogen that causes blue baby syndrome. Phosphorus leads to something called eutrophication. That's this, like you see in the bottom there, the slimy green algae. I chose that picture because it was kind of reminiscent of the large-scale landscape, but that's a close-up of just slime that is growing on a lake, and we have what's called internal loading. Phosphorus just cycles in the water. Too much of it is in aquatic ecosystems. It leads to this algae, and that can become a problem. We'll talk about that in a moment here. So, in fact, right now. That leads to these hypoxic or dead zones in the world's oceans. So I'm not showing you the global map. These dead zones are all over the place, anywhere where there are major agricultural centers on Earth. But this is showing the Mississippi watershed. So most of America is drained by the Mississippi. And that land that is draining, that the Mississippi is draining, is America's prime farmland. This is where we grow all the corn and all the wheat. The corn that feeds the cows that makes your burgers, and the wheat that makes your bun. And so you can see there in pink, those are the cities, and the bright green, those are the farms. Most of that watershed is farms. So this is where people are applying phosphates to nitrogen and phosphates to the farmland. That fertilizer gets washed into the watershed and promotes the growth of algae. Right? It doesn't stay in the soil. It washes into the watershed, promotes the growth of algae. That algae washes out to the ocean, and what happens is the algae dies and it falls to the bottom, and it begins to decompose. And as the algae decomposes in the ocean there, that yellow area right off of Louisiana, New Orleans, it sucks up all the oxygen that's dissolved in the water, and suddenly there's no oxygen in the water for the fish to breathe, and we get these dead zones, these large portions of the world's oceans where nothing's alive, and nothing can live because whatever's there can't breathe. I guess you could have dolphins, but no dolphin would be there because there's nothing for them to eat, right? So, and here's just a picture, a typical picture of a fish kill that happens because of these annual hypoxic dead zones that happen every year in the Gulf, right around Louisiana. This is bayou down there in Louisiana, the Grass Bayou, and there's just literally billions of fish will wash into shore because the fish get trapped in a hypoxic zone. The oxygen crashes, oxygen levels crash, and fish die. So it's and a farmer up in Iowa may not be thinking about how choices they're making in terms of fertilizer application and phosphorus load that they're putting on the land is going to impact the livelihood of a fisherman, for example, who's living 1,000 miles away or more down in Louisiana. But it is all connected. Okay, so before humans, before Haber, early phosphorus sources of phosphorus fertilizer are on the right-hand side. So those include manure from cows and guano. So we heard the story of Nauru and all the guano from the birds that had accumulated on that island. It was a rich source of phosphorus. Flooding is a source. So, for example, the annual inundation of the Nile is what makes the Nile Delta so rich, the soil so rich, because it's bringing silt, and silt has phosphorus in it, right? And that's what made Egypt one of the major sources of wealth and a major civilization in the ancient world. Crop rotation is another way. So there are the practice of doing crop rotation, where you have certain crops that are less phosphorus intensive than others. You can plant a crop that and you till it under to enrich the soil. And people would source their phosphorus locally early on. So whatever source was around you, you would go for it. But contemporary phosphorus is strip mines. And has anyone ever seen a strip mine? Has anyone ever been to a strip mine? They're not. You have seen one? Yeah. What was your impression of that? Super barren. Yeah, super barren. It's just like a canker sore on the earth. It's sort of a place where once it's been stripped of the mineral resource, it's just this open wound on the landscape that serves very little purpose at that point. So that's not a really sustainable way to source your phosphorus. Okay, so we talked about Nauru. So here is the historical global source of phosphorus fertilizer. And you see how the green baseline down there is manure. There's a little dotted line that's guano, and people used human excreta for sure as a fertilizer. You got to do something with it. Everybody poops, and it's got plenty of phosphorus in it. And so For a long time, those were the primary sources of phosphorus. And then around the mid 18th century, when they began to really understand the role of phosphorus in plant growth, the phosphorus was sourced from phosphate rock. And you can see that right around World War II, right around at the end of the middle to end of World War II, this is when phosphorus extraction from inorganic phosphorus extraction from rock really began to explode. So that's where we are, and you can imagine that could potentially go on forever, right? Because I said that there were 68 teratons of phosphorus in the bedrock, and we take last year we took like 0.26 of a teraton just for that year. But it's just.
What was the dip in 1990?
I don't actually know why the mid-90s saw a dip. It may have been specifically the historical story behind that. That's a great question. I would, hope a student does a podcast on it sometime so I can learn about it. I don't know what the story is, why that is. It could have been, if I were to speculate, perhaps like the way they had probably gotten all the low-hanging fruit by the late 80s, and it had begun to drop off, and so they had to develop new techniques of mining, is what my guess is. I mean, it's becoming increasingly harder to source phosphate. I don't know that story, though, and I'd love to hear it. But, so I'm going to expand this graph for you and extrapolate a little bit. So a lot of people talk about peak oil, right? People are worried about peak oil, and peak oil meaning that we have extracted the most oil out of the ground that we can, and we're going to be continually diminishing amounts of oil. Well, yeah, I mean, oil is a source of energy, right? That was what we use it for primarily. There are other sources of energy, but phosphate, you can't substitute phosphate. Phosphate is phosphate. We need phosphate. Life on Earth needs phosphate. And there are, this is not just like wild-eyed, bleeding heart, liberal, progressive environmentalists that are worried about phosphate. This guy over here, Jeremy Grantham, I don't know if any of you finance students, how many finance students are there? You're one, right? Albert, Jake. Who else is in finance? A couple of you? No, George is. Yeah, he's not here. Well, anyways, this guy, a very mainstream billionaire investor from Britain that lives in Boston, wrote a paper in an editorial in Nature, or an analysis in Nature magazine, which is like the top, between Nature and Science, those are the two very top science journals in the world. He was published in 2012, early on, where he said, we are rapidly approaching peak phosphorus, and that the human consumption of phosphorus has got to be dramatically, the word he said, must be drastically reduced in the next 20 to 40 years, or the planet will begin to starve. And this is the best dynamic estimate of what phosphorus requirements are going to be. And a lot of that is being driven by Asia. So the predominant population explosion that's left to happen on Earth is in Asia and Africa. As those countries develop, developing countries tend to be ones where there's more rapid population growth. And it's going to push us to peak phosphorus. And you can see the green line is demand. The green line is demand. And so, interesting, you were asking about the notch in the late 90s there. If you look there is certainly an increase in the demand, and that was not being met by the supply there. And there were also significant famines that happened during that time in the developing world. So, yeah, I don't know. There's a story there that I'm not able to tell you yet. But if you look, that gap between that green line and the estimate of phosphate extraction, that is what you call famine and starvation. That's people not being fed. There are a lot of people on the planet now, right? About 8 billion people, and there are different estimates as to what that population cap is going to be. This slide is one of the primary components of developing those population-based estimates. People who aren't taking into account phosphorus availability aren't really able to say what the peak population is going to be, because energy and space and all that is nothing if you can't feed people. All right.
Didn't you say that we have a ton of phosphate resources in the bedrock, though?
Absolutely, but our ability. So this is the stuff of the Earth, right? The like physical shell of the Earth, all of that rock of the Earth that we are standing on. So to actually, the feasible extraction of that, where it's not profoundly disrupting the economic stability and the just viability of the land. It's the vast majority of that phosphorus is, for all practical purposes, inaccessible. All right, so here's a fun story. P cycling. I talked about how phosphorus was originally discovered. And that was Henning Brandt and his experiments, the alchemist in the 17th century who got all the putrid, the 1,500 gallons of putrid urine and boiled it down until he finally got a little golf ball-sized wad or grape-sized wad of glowing white phosphorus, glow-in-the-dark phosphorus. Well, there's phosphorus in urine, and there's nitrogen in urine as well. So, and there are some people who are trying to take advantage of that. Here's a little story about this group called the Rich Earth Institute right here in New England in Brattleboro, Vermont. So urine, turns out the wastewater stream that like when you flush a toilet, when you take a shower, when you wash the dishes, when you wash your clothes, et cetera, urine is less than 1% of the domestic wastewater. An extremely small amount of the fluid that goes down the tubes is urine. But it contains 80% of the nitrogen in wastewater. 80% of the nitrogen and approximately 55% of the phosphorus. Phosphorus would be higher, but phosphate-based detergents and soaps represent the remaining 45% of the phosphorus, as in your Tide laundry detergent or whatever. But still, a significant amount of the phosphorus and nitrogen are concentrated in 1%. That's a low-hanging fruit. An easily accessible source of fertilizer that does not require us to strip mountains off and burrow down miles into the earth looking for extremely inaccessible phosphorus. So what do? They collect urine and they transfer that into these big tanks. And here's this guy transferring urine into one of these collection tanks. So 275 gallons is the amount of urine that a family of 3, you and your mom and dad, can make in 8 months. So just during the school year, not even quite the school year. All right. You get all this urine. What do you do with it then? you take it and you put it in these solar sterilizers. They sterilize it. This is not quite like boiling it the way Henning Brandt did, but it's kind of similar. It puts it in these, just like, has anyone used a solar hot water heater before? Yeah, no? Well, it's essentially the same thing, but instead of hot water, it's for a shower, it's urine, I guess, yeah.
What are they, sounds stupid, but like, what are they sanitizing it for? Because isn't urine already sterile?
Urine is sterile when it comes out,
Right.
presumably. But if it's sitting around in a tank,
Yeah.
you're trying to collect 275 gallons of it over 8 months. That's certainly not sterile. I mean, urine is a nice, rich nutrient broth, so they sterilize it because you probably wouldn't be so keen to eat some vegetables that had urine that was sourced, or fertilizer sourced from this that hadn't been sterilized. Yeah, so they sanitize it, and then they are able to take this processed post urine and apply it to a crop. All right. So he's working on a test plot here with his little wand, and he's fertilizing it, and then they mulch it in with some hay, and they found that it was just as effective as artificial fertilizer. So you see here, this is hay that can be used for silage for different animals. The strip down the middle here is dark green, and the two adjacent strips did not receive any of this urine fertilizer. So it's an interesting thing. I think it would be, Colby wants to be sustainable, right? That's one of the major goals of reducing environmental impact. There are a lot of people on campus that pee, so it seems like we could grow more of our food up on the hill with our own urine. I don't know. We could get composting going. It's interesting if they got the infrastructure together so that it's not like you have to keep a bucket in your room or something like that, like the actual bathroom infrastructure. It wouldn't even really affect your usage of anything. But it's just the way we're using those resources instead of sending it to the wastewater treatment plants.
So, what about pooping?
Yeah.
What about pooping? Like, would that affect? Like, could you still get the urine from that?
Well, that's a great question. I don't know exactly how. So, I mean, for men using urinals, certainly that would be easy to divert that effluent. For people who are both defecating and urinating, how that would, I would imagine that would go to the brown waste, and for a woman who's just urinating, maybe there'd be an alternate flush that you could use on that toilet. I don't know how. It seems like a problem for some engineers, some students. I mean, this is just a little institute in Vermont. It's just some people, some environmentalists down there that are trying to figure it out. But there's clearly a lot of things to figure out how to actually implement it properly. Could be you, man. All right, so there's phosphorus. We'll put a little white thing around phosphorus there with Henning Brandt. Oh, my haiku. Report, Willie Pete. Don't hide behind a smoke screen. How many killed? Maimed. So Willie Pete is it's a military, like Tango Charlie, whatever. It's the military code for WP, which stands for white phosphorus. And this is just alluding to the fact that phosphorus is an important component of a lot of ordnance, a lot of munitions, and certainly has led to the deaths of many, many, many people. All right, so that's phosphorus. We've done nitrogen. We've done phosphorus. What's left in the Reed field ratio? What were the three elements of the Reed-Field ratio that we talked about?
Carbon.
What's that?
Carbon.
Carbon. Yeah, the Redfield ratio, pardon me. Yeah, carbon. So we're going to start with carbon. And to do that, I'm going to introduce Lavoisier again to you. But before that, we got to see what Lavoisier was fighting against. I'm sure I probably have mentioned Aristotle already in this class. Pretty seminal mind. But he was the one that came up with the four elements: earth, air, fire, and water, and believed that all of what is observable is made up of one of these four elements that have the four properties combination of moist, warm, dry, and cool. So things that are moist and warm are air, like your breath; cool and moist is water, etc. But Lavoisier was skeptical. Like any good scientist, he was skeptical. And he said, I don't think so. I think an element, he comes up with a definition of element, and we're going to see what that is in a minute. He sought a more rigorous definition of what an element was. And he did this with carbon. Carbon itself had been known since ancient times. You could find a chunk of coal and chuck it in the fire and it would burn. You could take charcoal, a piece of wood, and get it down to charcoal and use that as a fuel. However, in 1789, he recognized it as an element. And so on the right-hand side here, we see Lavoisier depicted with his wife, Madame Marie Anne Lavoisier. She does not get as much recognition as Lavoisier for certain, because the studies indeed were undertaken at Lavoisier's on his initiative, but she was instrumental and probably no less of a genius than Lavoisier himself. She was the daughter of some nobleman who was looking to marry her to some rich guy who became a suitor, some baron, or I don't know, some guy, some nobleman who was quite elderly, and was also apparently kind of odious, and she wasn't into it, and the dad wasn't into it. So Lavoisier, she was only 13 at the time. Lavoisier became impressed with her intelligence, and also sort of came to her rescue and married her and saved her from being married off to this old rich guy. So she, because of that, dedicated herself to the same cause as Lavoisier. She transcribed all of his notes. She did all of his technical drawings. She helped him analyze his data, helped him devise experiments. So they were truly a team. They were a team, and it's kind of notable because it's prior to this, you don't really find examples of that in the history of science. So Marie Anne deserves some credit. And he's sort of looking to her for some guidance there. What was their concept of elements? Well, to them, an element is indeed something that can combine with something else to form a compound. So one or two or more things can come together and form a compound, but that is not sufficient for the definition of an element. All right, because you can have a compound. You can have two compounds come together and make some larger compound. All right. The key thing about elements is that they themselves cannot be decomposed into two other things. You cannot transform an element into two other things. They don't decompose. You can combine them with things, but they cannot be decomposed. So that's what I'm trying to show in that diagram there. And so all of this was in his pursuit of what combustion actually is and the undermining of the idea of phlogiston. Phlogiston, have I talked about phlogiston? Yeah, okay. He was trying to undermine the notion of phlogiston, and he did several experiments trying to basically describe what combustion is. It's the combination of carbon and oxygen to produce carbon dioxide. So he showed he needed a pure source of carbon to do this, and he showed that diamonds were entirely made of carbon and that you could combust them. And the only product that they would burn with oxygen, who he identified as an element and named Priestley identified it as an element, and Lavoisier gave it the name oxygen. He showed that oxygen combined with diamonds to release a carbon dioxide. He burned a diamond. He burned a diamond. That is serious. That's serious. How did he do it? Well, up at the Louvre, he set up one of these enormous burning glasses. That is a compound magnifying glass there. Look at the scale of that thing. On a really sunny day, he would focus the rays of all of that sun down to a pinpoint on a diamond. That this diagram it's showing smoke rising off the diamond, but in fact, there was a bell jar that captured the gas, and he also showed that there was a conservation of mass. So the diamond would get burned, completely combusted, and by what must have been profoundly intense heat of this magnifying glass. But then the mass of the bell jar didn't change. The carbon was oxidized to carbon dioxide, and it stayed, the mass of the jar stayed the same. So, pretty cool experiment, in my mind. Sadly, this guy's life was cut, quite literally cut, short by the French Revolution. The French Revolution was a dogmatic, bloody, and kind of irrational time. And despite the fact that Lavoisier fought quite strenuously for lessening the tax burden on the poor and for the rights of the poor, he himself was part of the aristocracy. And so that made him a target. Also, all scientists and academics at the time were viewed as being not of the people. And so, intellectualism was targeted. And he had his head removed from his body in 1794, as, I don't know what year that was, how old he was, in his 30s or something. He was young. But his wife carried on and continued to publish his findings and disseminate the ideas that they had come to. So we're going to put Lavoisier up there around carbon, although he left his mark on a lot of the elements. And with that, we have circled all of the green. I'm not going to go through each of those little blue trace elements one by one, because this lecture wouldn't end until December. But we'll touch on a couple of them later in the semester. Certainly iron, maybe iodine, a couple of them. Carbon, show-stealing diva, throw yourself at anyone decked out in diamonds. All right. So why is carbon so important? Well, life on Earth is carbon-based. Everything that's alive on Earth, from the lowliest virus, if you want to call that alive, even a prion, a protein pathogen, all the way up to us, everything in between, we're all made of carbon. And importantly, carbon represents energy. It represents energy. So that carbon-carbon bond has about 83 to 85 kcals per mole. Kcals being a big C calorie, like we defined early on in the semester, or in SI units, 347. And that because the reason that there's a range is it depends on what else is attached to that carbon is going to affect that bond energy. And carbon-hydrogen bonds are also quite energetic. This is why methane is such a rich energy source. It's just a carbon with 4 hydrogens attached to it. By the way, as an aside, when I'm right now I'm building lectures about macromolecules, and it occurred to me that because you are non-science majors, that your understanding of basic chemistry may be a little bit shallow, and I don't want to lose anyone, so I'm going to spend a whole lecture on just giving you very just a refresher course on some basic chemistry. That will be coming up as I get into the biomolecules. When I start talking about proteins and carbohydrates and lipids, it could maybe seem like some hardcore chemistry if you guys haven't been reminded of stuff. So that reminder's coming. Okay. Why else is carbon important? Well, the carbonate that is dissolved in your blood is one of the primary buffers of your blood pH. So your blood pH is approximately 7.35, and it does not want to be very far from that. Very, very small deviations around in the order of 2/10 of a 2/100, pardon me, of a pH unit is the upward and lower range around 7.35. Anything outside of that, and you do not feel good. Anything below 7 or above 7.8, and you are dead. So acidosis, yeah.
So what this is saying is that carbon regulates that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, yeah, it's the concept of a buffer, and I don't want to spend, because it would probably take me the rest of class to go into what a buffer is in detail. But a buffer essentially is it's just preventing rapid change in a pH, and so the carbonate that's dissolved in your blood that gets there because you're respiring, there's cellular respiration, you're breaking down, you're combusting the sugars, it's producing carbon dioxide, which becomes carbonate in your blood, carbonate and carbonic acid. It's buffering the blood. When you run a lot and you produce a lot, the CO2, the carbonic acid goes up, the lactic acid goes up in your system, and that pushes you into acidosis. Has anybody run so far or hard that it made them vomit? Or like exercise so hard that you vomited? So that's what happens when you go into acidosis. Your body's producing all this acid, metabolic byproducts that are acidic. It pushes your pH, your blood pH, down, and your body's like, need to get the acid out. And so one of the ways your body does that is by vomiting, and that removes stomach acid. We'll talk about how stomach acid is made later on. You'll get to see why that works like that. But it's also important for regulating the pH of the ocean. So carbonate in the ocean stabilizes the pH of the ocean and is a source of carbon, inorganic carbon, for all the things out there like the coral and the seashells, the different mollusks that need that inorganic carbon. However, the atmospheric concentration of carbon dioxide has been going up. Here you can see the chart from 1960 till I think it stops at 2008 in this diagram. But as carbon dioxide levels have been going up, the carbon dioxide that is dissolved in the seawater is also going up, which is the scattery blue line. And then that's been driving the pH down because we're dissolving more carbonic acid. in the water. Carbon dioxide is in equilibrium with carbonic acid. And that's alluding to its importance in global climate change. Carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas. It's driving temperatures up in the world because of that. And finally, carbon dioxide is important because it maintains the oxygen in the atmosphere. All right. So plants go through photosynthesis, which we'll talk about how photosynthesis works in a few lectures. But all the oxygen that's in carbon dioxide, that is the reserve. That's our source of oxygen. Plants liberate it for us. And so carbon acts as an oxygen reserve in terms of carbon dioxide. So those are the reasons carbon is extremely important.
Why are there so many fluctuations?
So it may be, so this is not my data set, but the fluctuations in the burgundy line, the atmospheric up and down, it looks very regular. Can you guess what that is? Huh? It's seasonal. Yeah, it's seasonal. So when summer comes on and all the plants are fixing carbon dioxide, the carbon dioxide level goes down, and then in the winter it goes up because there's no photosynthesis happening. All right, and it's mostly being driven by the northern hemisphere. I think it's the northern hemisphere, which is where most of the photosynthesis happens. Yeah, so that's why there's this seasonal oscillation in the level of carbon dioxide. Certainly, that's driving some of the variability in the seawater, but the scale of it is they're both on different scales. So my guess is it because like the atmospheric carbon dioxide is parts per million, and the seawater is microatmospheres. They're like totally different units. So I would say that the variation in the seasonal PCO2 is what's driving that oscillation. All right. Photosynthesis. What a great introduction to this concept. And I'm just going to start this topic with you, and you'll have to, and we'll pick up with it later. But this guy here, Jan Baptista van Helmont, that lived in the 16th century, he was arrested by agents of the Spanish Inquisition for the high crime of studying plants and other phenomena. He was just interested. He was a botanist. He wanted to know how, he was an early botanist. He wanted to know how plants did what they did, why they did what they did. And while he was under house arrest by these uptight Jesuits, not that all Jesuits are uptight, the ones nowadays, I know some great Jesuits. But back then, it was pretty, Inquisition wasn't cool. So he was under arrest, and he wanted to figure out how plants grow. So I've got this cartoon here. And this is showing him sitting there. I don't know, that's a kind of a weird cartoon, actually. It's just showing him with like Seattle or what is that, Toronto, the sky needle in the background. He's wondering, countless tons of mass hangs in thin air above our heads, but where does the bulk come from? What do trees build themselves out of? So what he essentially did is, in what was widely viewed as one of the very first genuine biological experiments, he carefully weighed out 200 pounds of dried soil. He put it in a pot, and he planted a willow shoot in it and sat there and let it grow and watered it when it needed it. And then after 5 years, he dug the plant from the pot, shook off all the soil, and the shoot, which initially only weighed 5 pounds, now weighed 169 pounds. He dried and weighed the remaining soil and was wondering, had the soil lost 164 pounds? Of course it hadn't, right? Because that's not where plants build their mass from. No, it only lost a couple ounces of mass, which probably corresponded to the phosphorus and nitrogen nutrients and the micronutrients that were picked up, or maybe he spilled something. 2 ounces is pretty small. So, but it had grown radically. How had it done itself? The answer, photosynthesis. Photosynthesis. He didn't figure out photosynthesis. In fact, he thought it was water. He thought it was water that had led to all that weight. So,
Did he measure the amount of water that he...
I don't know. It seems like he should have. But no, I don't know. He probably did, I would guess, and which is maybe why he thought it was water. All right. So in the yellow box up there is the overall equation for photosynthesis. So we have carbon dioxide, which adds to water, driven by light energy, and the byproducts are oxygen gas and a molecule of empirical formula CH2O. CH2O. And N is simply whatever, typically 6. It's usually 6 because that CH2O, that subscript is 6 usually, which is what glucose is, carbohydrate of glucose. But they just go about doing things in this ratio. So N equivalents of carbon dioxide plus N equivalents of water and add some light, and you get N equivalents of oxygen and 1 equivalent of an N-length carbon chain. So the energy that is sunlight is captured in the formation of those carbon-carbon bonds that I showed you a few slides ago when I talked about 83 kilocalories per big C calorie per mole, or 99 kcals per mole of CH bonds. That energy, all that energy, is coming from sunlight. That it's being converted and used to form carbon bonds. And we're going to look at photosynthesis not in like hardcore detail, but I am going to show you a rough overview, but a little bit more fine detailed than this next time. So, all right, the last point here is that chemical energy that is stored in these carbon-carbon bonds gets released as ATP during what's called cellular respiration, not respiration. I'll fix my slide. So, yeah, we'll pick up next time with a more detailed exploration of photosynthesis and what it's actually doing, how it plays into the carbon cycle, and how it creates, it's the foundation of all the food that we're going to eat. Okay, questions about any of that? So, the podcast for this week is all about farts. There's 2. There's one, as you're listening to them, I want you to think about who the podcasts were made for. Who's the listening audience? Because that's the answer, the question I want you to be asking yourself right now as you're designing your podcast. All right? So, all right. Have a nice day.